Welcome to the Mike Litton Experience podcast. Mike has over 31 years experience in real estate, finance, and investing. He's passionate about being a father, a teacher, a realtor, an investor, and a leader. Everyone has a story, and our passion is to help them tell it. And now, introducing the host of the Mike Litton Experience, Mike Litton.
So what can you expect from the Mike Litton Experience? You can expect stories that will inspire, motivate, advice that will sharpen your focus, and expert information on real estate, finance, and market conditions. Dr. Brian Domitrovic, thank you so much for being on the Mike Litton Experience.
Thank you very much, Mike. It's great to be here.
We're super excited to have you. So you were the co-author with Dr. Arthur Laffer of Taxes Have Consequences, which is one of my favorite books. And I want to talk about that in depth. But I also want to just kind of go through your life story real quick, if that's okay. Sure. We believe everybody has a story, and our passion is to help them tell it. Mm-hmm. What we know, Doctor, is that as you tell your story, there will be people out there that will hear your story and they will connect with you. And that's what we're about. We're about people connecting and then inspiring and motivating them through that connection.
Sure. Yes,
so let's start with where you were born.
Yeah, I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
So I grew up and I lived there, well, through high school.
Yeah.
And that's born and raised.
So what was your favorite thing about growing up in Pittsburgh?
Yeah, well, I grew up in the 70s and in the 80s. Pittsburgh, great city. It's that was the golden era, the Steelers and the Pirates. I mean, I was 12 when the Steelers and the Pirates both won the World Series and the Super Bowl. And
right, so they called them Title Town that year. Yeah,
you don't need to do anything else in life. That's all that happens. I've gotten to know a little bit Phil Garner when I lived in Houston. I got to know him fairly well. He was the Pirates' second baseman from that time. Then he was manager of the Houston Astros. And we used to talk about that, about how great it is for like little boys to have their teams win the World Series. So
absolutely,
that might be the highlights.
Oh, that's cool, man.
Yeah.
So going to high school, which high school did you go to in Pittsburgh?
Yeah, I went to Central Catholic High School, which is kind of right in the middle of the city in Pittsburgh.
Okay. Did you have a favorite subject?
Well, it's high school that got me interested in the topic we're going to talk about today. Okay. So this was the first term of the Reagan administration, and my major activity was in forensics, in public speaking, and all the topics that we had to discuss in current affairs were about supply-side economics and Reaganomics.
Right.
And that completely launched my interest in this topic right then.
Yeah, the Reagan administration did the same thing for me. So I know exactly what you're talking about. And we're not much different in age, it sounds like. Yeah. So in growing up, who was the most influential person to you growing up?
Well, certainly, my family. I mean, I dedicated the book, my first book that I wrote 15 years ago about the history of supply-side economics, the Reagan Revolution in economics, book called Iconoclasts. I dedicated to my forensics coach, Brother Robert Wilsbach, FSC. I dedicated the book to him because he's the one who really got me going. And hey, learn how to speak about this before audiences and learn how to absorb the topic and then relate it to other people. So I'd mentioned Brother Robert.
I love it. Okay. So you graduate high school. Where do you go?
Then I went to New York City for college. I went to Columbia University for college. And that was, I guess, maybe in the second term of the Reagan administration. And I got to see the incredible economic boom that just took over New York City after its period of terrible degradation in the 70s.
Early shape.
Yeah, and just so much business activity was coming to New York because Reagan, we can talk about this maybe later on.
Oh, sure.
Caused a complete reorganization of all businesses in the United States because all businesses as of 1980 were successful given the current high tax code.
Right.
Well, he lowered tax rates. He ruined all the business models in the United States of all currently successful businesses. So incredible reorganization had to take place. And so much of that was thought through and implemented in New York City. And so as a college kid, I kind of got to witness all that energy at that time.
That's awesome. So you graduated with a degree in economics?
In history. So my major was history.
Okay.
I first started as an economics student, but then got more interested in history, and then was also a math minor because that had been required for an economics major. So I was a history major and a math minor.
Gotcha. So you graduate from Columbia, then where do you go?
Then I taught public school for a year in the Bronx.
Oh, I bet that was
Kind of
interesting.
enjoyed. That was neat.
What grade did you teach?
I taught seventh grade, social science
Wow.
and math, my two fields. Again, in the South Bronx, and it was, the last golden era of a completely terrible neighborhood. Since then it's been renovated, but it was still, there were still 2,000 murders in New York City in that year. It's terrible, but it was great to be with the kids in the South Bronx. I mean, that was a wonderful experience. And then I went to graduate school the year after that. I went to Harvard for graduate school and got a PhD in history.
Awesome. That's amazing. Okay. So we're up to, so you graduate from, or you receive your PhD or earn your PhD, what year?
I got the PhD in 2000.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. So then from there, where did you go?
Then I taught at a couple schools for the next 5 years, including back in Pennsylvania. And then for good, I got a tenure track job teaching history at Sam Houston State University near Houston, Texas, which then has become my favorite city in the United States. Yeah. And I lived in Houston for 16 years and was chairman of the history department at Sam Houston State in Huntsville, which is near Houston. I lived in the Woodlands, which is one of the greatest suburbs ever created. Yeah. And I got to see just the economic boom. The American dream, I think, is operational in Houston, Metro Dallas too, Texas in general, better than any place I've ever seen.
Yeah.
So the American dream is just alive and well for everybody in Houston, Texas.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. So 16 years, then where do you go?
Then, well, I had been working with Arthur Laffer ever since I wrote my first book in 2007. A lot, and then I started working full time for him, remotely at first in Houston, and then 2.5 years ago, I moved to Nashville. So I left the academy, I left my university job, and I work with Arthur Laffer full time now. Have done now for 4 years.
And he used to be in San Diego.
Yeah, but it was the highest tax state in the country. California was, and so he said I wanted to go to the lowest tax state in the country, and he moved his whole operation from California to Nashville in 2006.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know he's happy you did that. So you now work for Dr. Laffer full time, right? Yes, and you write with him, Taxes Have Consequences.
Yep.
What was your favorite thing about writing that book?
Yeah, and we had one other co-author, Jeanne Sinquefield, who was just incredible with us. Yeah. Well, my favorite thing, I think I agree. His favorite thing in the book turns out to be a chapter that I wrote. So I think it's my favorite too. So I one of the chapters I wrote, we worked on it all together, of course, but one of the chapters, just mine, was chapter 2, which was 20 vignettes on the biggest ways that top 1% earners have striven not to report their income legally for taxation. And so just looking at all the tax shelters that the rich have used when tax rates have gotten high turned out to be a really fun task because they are so creative at that. And they were all terribly legal.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with it, but they really figured out how to skirt those tax rates. So that was probably my favorite chapter.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite chapters too. And I love the fact, I love how it set the table for the rest of the history that you covered in the book. Right, because the basic theme, or pardon me, let me put it this way: the basic takeaway that I have from this is every time we raise taxes, the wealthy figure out a way to either lower their income or take it somewhere else. Right, like they'll go offshore, whatever it is that they need to do, because they have that capability. Right. So years ago, I've been on radio and television in San Diego since 2011. But years ago, I was on radio during the Obama administration. And one of the things that they kept doing was they kept increasing regulations. They kept increasing taxes. And the whole idea was they were going to get people who were self-employed. They were going to go after these people that had, supposedly this monstrous amount of money. I have friends in our industry. I'm in real estate out here, but I have friends in our industry that are in construction and that type of thing, that when taxes get too high and they see a recession coming, because there's a correlation between the two every single time, when they see that, this guy actually takes all of his equipment, parks it in a field, locks it up, and takes 3 years off.
Yep. Right.
doesn't come back until until everything gets more encouraging. And right. I mean, there's real wisdom to what you found in your research in terms of what I've seen people do, because they're just not incentive. You know, the thing that I kept trying to tell people was being self-employed in the United States is a choice. It's not a requirement, right? You can decide to shut it down at any time. I just sat and had breakfast or lunch with a guy yesterday at a business conference, and we were talking about that very thing. He got to a point to where taxes basically kept being increased, and so did regulations. And he just got to a point to where he just decided to not do it anymore. He just kind of retired. Now he's getting back in, right?
Sure. Speaking of monster amounts of money, our co-author, Jeanne Sinquefield, will not be too embarrassed to reveal that, she and her husband, Rex, and their business partner, David Booth, are such people with monster amounts of money. They founded Dimensional Fund Advisors, the 8th largest money manager in the country. Jeanne just confirmed, of course, with all sorts of real world experience, what people with a lot of resources are capable of doing. They have acquired a lot of resources, so they know how to protect what they have. Much better than the tax code does.
Exactly.
The tax code has to learn it from them. Moreover, they have all the freedom to do that. They don't need the money. They don't need income streams. They have all the potential expertise. So they have the whip hand. They can do anything they want with their money. So if you raise the price of earning money, they are the best at making sure they don't have to pay that price. And doing it legally as well. That's the kicker, because the government just have to, we have abuse of evidence after evidence in the book. The government's like, yeah, you win. You're right.
Well, that's why I love chapter 2 so much, because it really did set the stage for all of the rest of the history that you covered. I mean, I learned so much about the Great Depression, the Roaring '20s and the Great Depression. And I mean, I knew about Smoot-Hawley, right? But I didn't know the details about Smoot-Hawley as it related to taxes. I mean, anyway, it was, your book is just amazing. Absolutely amazing. And I'm sure you can tell I'm completely geeking out over it. So one of the things that I love the most, one of the things that made me a huge fan of Dr. Laffer was the Economic Recovery and Tax Act of 1981, where he was the chief architect of that law, right? And one of the things that he included was a thing called ACRS, which is something I've talked about and taught about for years. It literally took commercial real estate and gave it a shot in the arm, and residential real estate as well, a shot in the arm that we needed. We were in bad shape when this law was implemented. And man, it was incredible. We literally had the single greatest period of organic economic growth that we've ever seen before or since in this nation. I mean, absolutely incredible.
No, the 1981 was amazing. So the accelerated cost recovery system for depreciation was amazing. So just to set the stage, I mean, in 1980, when Ronald Reagan was running for president, the top rate of the income tax was 70%, 70, 100 minus 30.
70,
Yeah, the top corporate rate was 46%. It had just been 48%, it had been 52% recently. So basically, a 50% corporate rate, a 70% top rate. So if you're talking people with money, say people are buying and selling buildings, they have to pay, their corporation has to pay 50%. And then if the firm pays a dividend, the individual has to pay 70% tax on that.
Exactly.
It's insane. So Reagan cut that top rate first from 70 to 50. And then he took the top rate from 50 to 28. While taking the corporate rate from 46 to 34. So all of a sudden just opened up all these possibilities. But there's one further tax cut that was just as big, and that was the elimination of inflation. So in the 1970s, when inflation was 14% per year, if a business wanted to take depreciation, you could only take the nominal amount of money that you spent against you. But if you'd spent that money 5 years before, meanwhile, inflation's been 10% per year, you can only deduct the actual amount.
Exactly.
That's not anything after
but
inflation.
It's eating up, as that's happening, it's eating up the purchasing power of that money dramatically.
Yeah. So that's why I'm going to say what I saw in New York City after 1985. The businesses that were successful as of 1980, say you take the Fortune, 500 as of 1980, look at those top 10. All those companies had figured out how to flourish better than anyone else in the high tax environment. When Reagan suddenly cut tax rates, those business models were destroyed.
But they were flipped on their head.
They were flipped. That's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
And then all these assets had to be sold and reorganized into new entities. And that's really what all that merger acquisition, corporate litigation, management consultant, iBanking stuff in the 80s was.
Yeah.
And that's settled. And then nobody needed New York anymore. And that's why New York's in decline right now. And they're not competitive because they've high tax rates. We needed New York for that decade or two to figure out how to accommodate the new Reagan tax cut. And then goodbye, New York, if you're not going to cut tax rates yourself.
Right, exactly. And goodbye, a mass exodus of people, and businesses are leaving New York, Wall Street included, and headed somewhere else.
Yeah, the 80s, Reagan really faked out New York City because it had a terrible 1970s, obviously, raising taxes. Now, Hugh Carey, the governor of New York State, cut tax rates really nicely in the latter 1970s, early 1980s. So, the top New York personal income tax rate was as high as 15%, which is just stupid. Yeah. And it went down below 10. So he had about a third of a cut or more. So that kind of got New York going again. But then Reagan brought all this business because corporate reorganization became the name of the game. New York mistook that in the 1980s, 1990s. Hey, we're back. We don't need to change anything. Right. No, that was temporary. Right. Now you have to cut tax rates yourself to attract businesses. They never got that message. Exactly. And that's why it's in decline.
Yeah. And it's you can see it. You can see it. You can feel it. For people who are telling me they can feel it there. So I sold new homes in Tampa, Florida a few years ago. And I ended up with a whole bunch of New Yorkers that were coming to Tampa, right? In fact, the firm that's responsible for being the clearinghouse for stocks on Wall Street, they moved everything to Tampa.
Okay,
They're now down there.
And all that, right.
Yeah, sure. The guy that runs it, I sold him his house.
Is that right? Yeah, sure. No, I see all that in Florida, all the Dunkin' Donuts and Wawa and all these East Coast things, so no, I know. I can touch my own experience. When I go to New York now, it's nowhere near as crowded. Everyone was there. So no, New York, you have to cut tax rates or Dallas is going to become the biggest city in the United States.
Exactly.
So cut tax rates, New York. You carried it in 1978.
And that was the brilliant thing about your book, was it literally lined out for anybody how taxes affect behavior, how taxes affect what people do, furtive movements, right? What they do to try to, for lack of a better term, mitigate the amount of taxes that they pay. And it's incorporating in different states. It's all kinds of different things that people do. Like you showed us, they're legal, right? But they do it because it's something that allows them to get out from under a lot of this burden. And so it's just, I feel like it's brilliant. So I wanted to share with you that I ended up on the Mike Reagan show in 1992 on the eve of the presidential election.
Okay.
And the reason I did was I was in a call center in San Marcos, right here by where I live. And we were calling people the day before the presidential election they were Republicans, right? We were just calling on behalf of the Republican Party to make sure that remind people that tomorrow's the election. We're looking forward to their support for then President Bush, right? 41. Yeah. And this lady who had voted 40 years Republican said, I'm not sure I'm going to vote for him this year. Yeah. And I stopped and I said, may I ask why? Right. And she said, she said, the Clinton campaign has made it sound like current then President Bush, who was then Vice President Bush in the Reagan administration, was asleep at the wheel when he was in charge of FSLIC, right? Federal Savings Loan Insurance Corporation.
Okay. Right.
And that was the reason we had the savings and loan crisis. And I asked her, I said, would you mind if we take a few minutes and talk about what really happened? And she said, I'd love to hear this. Nobody else is talking about it. So I took the next 20 minutes. And what I explained to her was the Tax Reform Act and Economic Recovery Act of 1981, and it implemented ACRS. ACRS drove up the the inherent, if you will, demand for real estate.
Mhm.
And that in 1986, Congress retroactively removed ACRS from the Tax Reform Act of 1986.
Yep.
And at the time, in 1994, there was this thing called the Participation Act that had been passed that allowed savings and loans to participate in these projects that they were financing.
Mhm.
And so a lot of them became equity partners in these projects. And when the 1986 Tax Reform Act hit, the night that it was signed, all of the master appraisals, all of the commercial appraisals nationwide were null and void that night. They all had to be redone the next day.
Right.
Because of the massive impact ACRS had
Yeah.
on commercial real estate, right?
Mhm.
So I explained all this to her. Went all the way to the end, and I explained it to her, right? And she said, you know what? I'm so glad you called. I'm voting for President Bush. And I said, well, I'm glad, I'm happy you made that decision, right?
Yeah.
You're right. And, thank you so much for your support. I hung up the phone. All 44 other people in the room had hung up the phones and were listening to everything.
Right.
They were like
Yeah.
hanging on every word. Okay.
Yeah.
I got a standing ovation. And the lady that was running it for the Republican. We hope you enjoyed another episode of the Mike Litton Experience. If you did, do us a favor, smash that subscribe button, tell your friends, family, and coworkers about our program, and wherever you get your podcasts, please leave us a rating. It helps us to connect with quality people just like you.
And that's a wrap. Another episode of the Mike Litton Experience in the books. Reach out to Mike on Instagram at Litton Realty. Want to meet with Mike? Check out calendly.com/Rio760.